Canning has a reputation problem. Most people associate it with a grandmother's basement and dusty mason jars, which means most people have completely missed the fact that it represents one of the most significant leaps in human food security ever recorded. Before canning existed, preserving food meant salt, smoke, fermentation, or fat, all of which alter the food significantly, and none of which could reliably preserve the full nutritional and textural character of fresh produce across a long winter. Canning changed that. It allowed a harvest taken in September to be opened in February and taste more or less like September. For the first time in human history, the gap between abundance and scarcity could be bridged without fundamentally transforming what was being preserved. The methods that follow aren't historical curiosities. They are tested, documented techniques that have fed families through wars, famines, and the ordinary difficulty of winter for 2 centuries. Some of them have been refined by modern food science. Some of them remain almost exactly as they were practiced in 1820. All of them still work, and understanding why they work is the difference between doing them safely and doing them wrong in ways that can cause serious harm. That distinction matters more with canning than with almost any other preservation method, and it will come up repeatedly in what follows. The method that started everything, and the one most people know least about, is the open kettle method, sometimes called the open bath method, which predates the sealed jar entirely. Nicolas Appert, the French confectioner who developed the foundational principle of heat-based food preservation in the early 1800s, was not working with glass jars fitted with rubber seals. He was working with wide-mouthed glass bottles sealed with cork and wax, submerged in boiling water for varying lengths of time, depending on the contents. Appert documented the principle that food heated sufficiently inside a sealed container would not spoil. And that idea was correct, even though he did not fully understand why. Louis Pasteur explained microbial activity 50 years later. Appert worked from observation. Food preserved this way stayed edible, and food preserved this way without adequate heat did not. He was doing controlled food science before the scientific framework for understanding it existed, and the method he developed remains the conceptual foundation of every canning technique practiced today. The open kettle method in its early form involved filling a jar or bottle with hot, freshly cooked food, sealing it immediately, and relying on the heat of the contents to create a vacuum as the jar cooled. There was no additional water bath and no pressure, just the heat of the food itself. Modern food safety guidance rightly identifies this method as insufficient for anything except the highest acid, highest sugar preserves. Think of jams and jellies, where the sugar concentration itself is hostile to microbial growth. For everything else, it is not adequate. But as a starting point for understanding what canning is actually doing, the open kettle method shows the 2 core principles, using heat to destroy microorganisms and a sealed environment to prevent recontamination. The open kettle method is where the story begins, and it is still used today for high sugar preserves in regions where it has been practiced continuously for 2 centuries. The boiling water bath is the method that turned domestic canning from an experimental practice into a household standard, and it remains the correct technique for any high-acid food today. The principle is straightforward. Filled, sealed jars are submerged in boiling water for a specified time. The heat penetrates the jar and destroys the microorganisms inside, and as the jars cool, the contraction of the contents creates a vacuum seal that prevents recontamination. What made the water bath transformative was not the technique itself, it was the reliability it introduced. The open kettle method depended on the food being hot enough when it went into the jar, which varied based on the cook, the food, and the conditions. The water bath standardized the heat application. Every jar in the canner received the same treatment for the same duration, which meant that success stopped being dependent on skill and became dependent on following a process. The high-acid foods that the water bath is appropriate for, fruits, pickles, jams, jellies, tomatoes with added acid, and fermented vegetables, are safe at boiling temperature because the acidity, measured as pH, of the food itself is hostile to the growth of Clostridium botulinum, the bacterium responsible for botulism. At a pH below 4.6, botulinum cannot produce the toxin that makes it dangerous. Acidic foods are therefore safely processed at the boiling point of water, 100 degrees Celsius at sea level, which is achievable in any pot deep enough to submerge the jars. The settler women who canned hundreds of jars each autumn understood this division practically, even before the microbiology was explained to them. Fruits and pickles went in the boiling water bath. Vegetables and meat required longer cooking or a different treatment entirely. The knowledge preceded the explanation by several generations, which is a good reminder that practical food knowledge and scientific food knowledge are not the same thing and do not always develop at the same pace. The water bath method, as practiced in the early 19th century, used whatever vessel was large enough to hold the jars, a copper wash boiler, a cast iron pot, or a purpose-built tin canner. The jars were elevated off the bottom of the vessel on a rack or a folded cloth to prevent direct contact with the heat source, which could cause thermal shock and cracking. Processing times were estimated from experience rather than tested by science, which meant they tended to run longer than strictly necessary, a margin of safety that served the early canners well, even if they did not understand exactly why. Salt pack canning is one of the oldest preservation methods incorporated into the early canning tradition, and it operates on a different principle from heat-based methods entirely. Instead of destroying microorganisms with heat, salt pack preservation creates an environment so osmotically hostile that most microorganisms cannot survive in it. Salt draws moisture out of both the food and any microbial cells present, effectively desiccating them. At sufficient concentrations, roughly 10% salt by weight in the surrounding brine, bacterial growth is suppressed to the point where the food remains stable for months. The method was practiced extensively across colonial North America and Europe for green beans, cabbage, fish, and meat before glass jar canning became widespread, and it continued in parallel with heat-based canning well into the 20th century. The practical process involves packing raw or blanched vegetables tightly into a crock or jar in alternating layers with coarse salt, not iodized table salt, which contains anti-caking agents that interfere with the preservation chemistry, but pure granular salt. The salt draws liquid from the vegetables, which combines with the salt to form a natural brine. The crock is weighted and sealed, and the contents are left to cure. What most people don't know about salt pack canning is that the final product requires desalting before use. Soak the food in fresh water for several hours or overnight to draw the excess salt back out of the food. This step was so standard in pre-industrial cooking that recipes from the period routinely omitted entirely, assuming any competent cook already knew to do it. Finding a recipe from the 1820s that calls for salt-packed beans without mentioning desalting is not an error. It is an indication of how thoroughly the technique was understood as background knowledge. The beans came out of the crock, went into fresh water, and then into the pot. This sequence was as automatic as rinsing a vegetable is today. The limitation of salt pack preservation is texture and flavor transformation. Vegetables that have spent months in a high-salt environment are not the same as fresh vegetables. They are softer, more intensely flavored. Cabbage, in particular, often ferments to a degree that alters it entirely, which in the case of sauerkraut is exactly the point. For beans and other vegetables, the texture trade-off was accepted because the alternative was no vegetables at all. For 2 centuries, salt pack canning was the difference between a winter diet that included vegetables and one that did not, and the people who relied on it did not consider the texture trade-off a problem. They considered it food. Lard sealing, packing cooked meat into a crock or jar, and covering it completely with rendered fat that sets solid as it cools, is a preservation method that modern food safety guidance treats with considerable caution, but which fed rural communities across Europe and North America for hundreds of years with a reliability that its current reputation does not fully reflect. The technique works because fat, when solid and unbroken, creates an anaerobic barrier that prevents the oxygen-dependent spoilage organisms from reaching the meat below. No oxygen, no aerobic bacterial growth. The classic application is confit, a French technique that involves cooking duck, goose, or pork slowly in its own rendered fat, then storing the cooked meat, submerged in that fat, in sealed crocks kept in a cool cellar. Confit prepared and stored correctly keeps for months. The technique was practiced in Gascony and the surrounding regions of southwestern France as a primary meat preservation method for centuries before refrigeration existed, and it continues today as a culinary tradition that happens to also be functional preservation. A critical variable with lard sealing is the completeness of the fat layer. Any gap, crack, or point of contact between the meat and the air is a point of failure. The meat must be fully submerged with a margin of fat above it, typically at least 1 inch, and the surface must remain unbroken. A crack in the fat from temperature fluctuation during storage is sufficient to compromise the seal and create conditions where dangerous anaerobic organisms, including Clostridium botulinum, can develop. This is the specific mechanism that makes lard sealing genuinely risky when practiced carelessly, and it is why the technique requires a stable, cold storage environment rather than a warm pantry. Settlers practicing lard sealing kept their crocks in root cellars that maintained temperatures between 35 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit through the winter. At those temperatures, the fat remained solid, the seal remained intact, and the preserved meat remained safe. The same technique practiced at room temperature in a warm kitchen is a different proposition entirely. The preservation method is not wrong. The storage conditions are the variable that makes it safe or dangerous, and understanding that distinction is what separates a technique that fed generations from one that causes harm. Fruit preserved in alcohol, brandy, whiskey, rum, or high-proof spirits is one of the most ancient preservation methods that found its way into early American and European canning practice, and it is one of the most reliable. Alcohol at sufficient concentration is directly toxic to the microorganisms responsible for food spoilage. At 40% alcohol by volume, the standard concentration of most spirits, bacterial and yeast activity is suppressed to the point where fruit submerged in the liquid is effectively stable at room temperature for a year or more. The method is simple to the point of requiring almost no instruction. Clean fruit, pack it into a sealed jar, and cover it completely with spirit. Brandy was the traditional choice for preserved cherries, peaches, and pears in European tradition. Rum was common in colonial America, where it was readily available and inexpensive. Whiskey was used in frontier regions where distilling was local and brandy was expensive or unavailable. The choice of spirit influenced the flavor of the final product significantly. Brandied peaches taste different from whiskey peaches, but the preservation mechanism was the same regardless. What distinguished this technique from simple marinating was the attention to coverage. Every surface of the fruit had to remain submerged in the alcohol continuously. Fruit that floated above the liquid line was exposed to air and the spoilage organisms present in it, which is why the jars were packed tightly, weighted where necessary, and checked periodically to ensure the liquid level remained above the fruit. The alcohol also extracts flavor compounds from the fruit over time, which means the spirit itself becomes a flavored liqueur, a secondary product that was not wasted. The technique required no heat, no special equipment, and no processing time beyond packing and sealing. It was therefore accessible to households that lacked the capacity for water bath or pressure canning, and it was practiced in remote frontier communities specifically because it required nothing that was not already available. The fruit preserved in alcohol in a settler household was simultaneously a food preservation strategy and the only prepared dessert many of those households would see between October and May. That dual function, preservation and luxury, explains why the technique persisted long after other methods became available. The pressure canner, which operates on the principle that water boils at a higher temperature under pressure, allowing the internal temperature of sealed jars to reach 116 degrees Celsius or above, was not developed until the late 19th century. But the principle it exploits had been understood and applied in rudimentary form significantly earlier. The pressure canner solved a problem that the water bath could not: the safe preservation of low-acid foods. Low-acid foods, vegetables like green beans, corn and carrots, all meats, all legumes, and most soups and stews, cannot be safely processed in a boiling water bath, because the botulinum organism can survive at 100 degrees Celsius. It requires sustained temperatures above 116 degrees Celsius to be reliably destroyed, and those temperatures are only achievable under pressure. The settlers who canned vegetables in a boiling water bath before the pressure canner existed were working with an incomplete understanding of the risk, and the historical record does include cases of botulism resulting from vegetables processed in a water bath. The development of the pressure canner was a direct response to that documented risk. Early pressure canners were simple devices: a heavy pot with a locking lid and a pressure gauge, operated over a wood fire. The challenge was maintaining consistent pressure over the length of the processing time, which required monitoring the gauge and adjusting the heat source accordingly. On a wood fire, this was significantly more difficult than on a gas or electric range, because the heat output of a wood fire is not instantly adjustable. Experienced home canners using wood fires developed a feel for managing the fire to maintain steady pressure, adding small pieces of wood to sustain the burn, damping the draft to reduce heat, reading the gauge, and anticipating changes before they became problems. The technique, as practiced in the late 19th and early 20th century on wood-fired stoves, was less precise than modern pressure canning, but not fundamentally different. The processing times were longer to account for the variability in heat maintenance, which provided a margin of safety that compensated for the imprecision of the heat source. The principle was correct. The execution was adapted to the available tools. That adaptation, using longer processing times to account for equipment variability, is a general approach to safe food preservation that remains valid whenever the equipment being used is less precise than ideal. Cold-pack raw canning, filling jars with raw, uncooked food before processing rather than pre-cooking the contents, is a method that settler canners used extensively, and that modern home canners sometimes overlook in favor of the cold-pack approach. The distinction matters because the two approaches produce different results in terms of texture, volume, and processing requirements. In the hot pack method, food is pre-cooked or heated before going into the jar, which shrinks it, allows more to fit, and means the jar goes into the canner already hot. In the cold pack method, raw food goes directly into the jar, packed tightly to account for the shrinkage that will occur during processing. And the heat of the canner both cooks the food and processes the jar simultaneously. The cold pack method was preferred by many early canners for fruits and firm vegetables because it preserved texture better. Food that is cooked twice, once before packing and once during processing, tends to be softer than food that is cooked only during processing. The practical difference in settler canning practice was significant. A cold pack jar of tomatoes retained more of the structure of the fresh tomato than a hot pack jar, which produced a product that had been heated to the point of partial breakdown before processing even began. For long-term storage where texture mattered, preserving peaches for winter desserts rather than for cooking down into sauce, cold pack was the method that produced a result closer to the fresh original. The cold pack method requires longer processing times than hot pack because the heat has to penetrate from the outside of the jar through the food to the center, and raw food conducts heat more slowly than pre-cooked food. Early canners accounted for this with processing times that seem excessive by modern standards. A cold-packed jar of peaches might have been processed for 45 minutes, where modern guidance recommends 25, but the longer times were a rational response to the uncertainty of heat penetration in a variable heat environment. The principle of erring toward longer processing times when uncertain about heat penetration is one that transferred directly from early settler canning practice into modern food safety guidance, even as the specific times have been refined by laboratory testing. The legacy of cold-pack raw canning is that it preserved the instinct to treat the food and the jar as a single system. It meant thinking about how heat moves through the specific contents of a specific jar in a specific environment rather than applying a single formula to every situation. That instinct, more than any specific technique, is what distinguished the settler canners who produced reliably safe, high-quality, preserved food from those who followed procedures without understanding the principles behind them. Understanding why you process for a given time rather than just following the number is the difference between a technique and a skill. The settlers who canned successfully for decades had the skill. They had to. There was no food safety hotline to call when something looked wrong. 2 centuries of canning history contain more useful food knowledge than most people will encounter in a lifetime of cooking, and most of it has never been more accessible or more relevant than it is right now. The methods that kept families fed through bad harvests, hard winters, and the ordinary uncertainty of life before the supply chain are not primitive. They are precise, principled, and entirely functional, and the only thing separating most people from that knowledge is the assumption that it no longer matters. If this kind of practical, pre-industrial knowledge is something you want more of, subscribe. Next, we will cover the fermentation techniques that kept vegetables edible across winter long before canning existed, and why the results were often nutritionally superior to anything a modern jar can produce.